got to deliver all the same stuff than other competitors might be doing, or other companies and expectations wise, but with all the constraints and no resources.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Startup Equity Matters. The topic today is, why do we have employee equity at all? Which is a fair question. 10 or 20% of our companies end up with our teams. So why are we doing this? What's it all about? I think it's an awesome topic. As you know, the enemy of Startup Equity Matters is the old school, complicated contracts, out-of-date team equity. No one knows what they own. It's just a big mess, big accounting and legal bills, all that stuff. That's what we're here to try and avoid. So how we do that is we bring on amazing guests to talk about their experiences and insights and how they've done it. And so, yeah, that helps you guys to tackle this stuff as best as you can and make sure it's as valuable as possible. Today, we have the wonderful Beth Nevins from Developa, all the way from London. Welcome, Beth.
Hi. Thanks, Jason, for having me.
Oh, I'm stoked to be talking to you today. You've got fantastic insights, and people and teams are, the core of many great businesses. It's so hard to innovate, and it's really hard to build a great team. So I'm excited to hear your experience in both building teams and how equity can be central to that. So welcome again.
Awesome.
Tell us about Developa. How did you come to, tackling the people space this way with Developa?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with what we do, and then I'll quickly go into like how we ended up being and existing. So Developa, we are a people and talent consultancy, and what's unique about us is we've come from startups ourselves. So we've lived that experience that founders are going through different rounds and right from the beginning as well. But there's three core areas that we focus and support founders on. One is, of course, candidates. So we retain, search, and bring great talent in, and raising that bar on the types of talent we want to bring into the company. And this will segue later into part of that is negotiating offers, where equity is an important part of that total compensation offer that you make to get great people. And then as the business starts scaling, of course, then we introduce people projects, where that's important to help the people experience, retain and engage, and support performance. So some of the types of projects we may build and support startups with are things like leveling and benchmarking and total compensation philosophies. Again, equity is usually a hot topic and a big part of the discussion there, and where that fits in the whole. Also, we do a lot on performance, and also things like onboarding and values workshops and so forth. And then the final thing we do, of course, segueing off the performance piece, is we do leadership coaching, and we uniquely train founders on two key areas in a program. One is on hiring, and the second one is on leading leaders. So we're quite full stack in how we operate and advise and get hands-on with the teams there. And we have a sweet spot on where we add the most value and where we kind of sit in terms of where we've lived historically, operationally. And that's from the well-funded seed stage companies to sort of Series C. So probably more the 0 to 500 headcount sort of arena. And that's within tech startups. And we're quite, geography agnostic of where we work. And clearly I've done it, so that's why I'm useful. But I started off as an agency. I started off as an agency recruiter for my sins, but I loved it. I was a proper hustler. And I started working with co-founders straight away, because that recruitment agency was unique and valuable to me looking back, because it only specialized in recruiting for startups. So I was exposed to co-founders and startup life from a very, very early age outside of uni. And then eventually transitioned internally. So I was reporting directly to those same types of founders, and building those startups from, pretty much 0 to 1 right the way through to later stage rounds and commercial expansion. So I've seen a lot consequently. So hopefully that means I'm useful to founders and startups ever since.
Oh, totally. Yeah, look, finding the right people, building teams is like it's one of the top couple of things that needs to be done. I mean, you got to find product market
Yeah.
fit and you got to build a great team.
Yeah.
We're fortunate at Cake, obviously, yeah, I mean, it's my opinion, but we've got such a great team. We've been able to do this really well. What would you say, in the seed stage are the bigger sort of people problems that teams tackle, and how does that differ from, say, sort of Series A and Series B? Because there'll be a lot of
Mm.
founders on here that are sort of seed and growing into Series A.
Yeah. So in terms of problems, like where things go wrong from a people perspective, it's either like, to be frank, like early on you can have co-founder fallout, and like a co-founder might leave. Honestly, like I've devised quite a lot of this, sporadically, and that's usually just because of misalignment on like goals, and how perception of understanding really what it takes. I had
How do
one
you how do you
co-founder.
solve that? Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
what's the sort of good ways
Well.
to solve that?
Mm. So, I mean, admittedly, where I've come in and advised is one has like recently one had like left, so I was helping the co-founder, now a solo founder.
Yeah.
So thinking about, okay, how do we buffer them what we actually need to build this product to support them based on their skill set. So if they're just purely commercial, then clearly we need someone very strong technically to build the thing for
Yep.
MVP. So that's like the first thing we need. The first thing we need to look at and what their strengths were. And then the other side is when someone's telling me they want to look for a co-founder. Again, this isn't my area of expertise full time, but I will still support. Is going through the questions with them, telling them these stories on the lessons learned. So, like, what are your values? What are their expectations of what the next 10 years plus commitment looks like? What are they a serial entrepreneur that wants a fast exit, or are they someone where really this is going to be their baby? And you tend to get that more with first time founders where they want to live and die and go down with the ship if things don't work till the very end. So, you've got to have those really honest conversations and their expectations. Where that one founder in the first story I mentioned had left, genuinely the CEO co-founder was telling me who remained was because that other co-founder thought he could build that company while like spending half the week traveling all around the world and hiking up mountains and stuff. Genuinely. So unfortunately that would be lovely.
That would be
But
great. I wish I was that talented.
it can work if you are a solopreneur, and I think that's a very different thing. But if you are
Mhm.
building a venture capital backed business, it's unlikely that is going to work. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that was interesting. And the other thing where people problem comes in very early on, will be what I call like stage fit misalignment. So if hires early on in the founding team don't work out, it 9 times out of 10, it's very rarely like resources or not even necessarily capability. Like often they're not capable because they haven't understood the 0 to 1 mentality and the fit that's required. And that's because they're not those candidates who come in early haven't been used to delivering the same outcomes that they might have done in later stage companies, but with nothing.
Mm.
You've got to deliver all the same stuff than other competitors might be doing or other companies and expectations wise, but with all the constraints and no resources. You've got limited money, limited people, limited tools. So a lot of people sink or swim in that if they aren't used to that or just don't have that right mentality
Mm.
to thrive in that type of environment.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That was going to be one of my questions. Is like, what, like, how does it work? One of the things I think we did well was, around seed stage, we hired a chief product officer and a chief marketing officer,
Mm,
which we decided to bring in great people that were sort of Series B plus and get them in early and then help them sort of scale the company. I
mm,
have a bit of a theory around, 0 to 1 is kind of generalists and then 1+ needs to be specialists.
mm,
How do
mhm,
you sort
mhm.
of see, when works to bring in those, quite experienced people and
Mm.
how businesses can make that successful? Any insights on that?
Yeah. So look, It does. There's a few things. I think bringing in some heavy hitters in earlier. What would be the argument for that? I think like if you have got a very, very seasoned team, that can genuinely help with like investment, arguably, right? In terms of investor attraction and so forth, because there's some confidence there, people who may have done it before and so forth, and you're treating them in the similar way of almost co-founders, but without perhaps the title and so forth. So there is some value in that, providing those same C-suite people, as I mentioned, can do everything and they're not just pure strategists, and they really are happy to be individual contributors early on. And the business model may require very early on, if you're well funded at seed as well, it may require you to have people who have got the pedigree of larger companies. So to articulate that better, what I mean is, let's say you are like a fintech or a banking company or in a very regulated environment, the customer demographic to even perhaps win your first customer or talking to that market and in certain countries may require quite experienced people right in front of them to get that initial traction. But if you are then building a direct to consumer product or a B2C app, it may not be required that you need those heavy hitters so early on, and you can preserve those titles and the sort of equity and so forth for more likely a Series A. So the general rule is it's usually a co-founders and then several high-end individual contributors. And then you expand that C-level title and that C-level team more likely at a Series A when you've got that initial sort of traction. But there's no one size fits all. It really does depend on the nuance of what the business is trying to do and how much they've raised and how fast they can sort of spin up initial ARR.
Yeah, totally makes sense. You've got to be able to get their hands dirty and get in and get things done and do a lot of things if you're going to have those senior people coming in early. Our idea was that, that would then help them build the team, because what we're trying to avoid was hiring a bunch of people and then having to hire in senior people and then they haven't got their own team and they haven't had a chance to build that team. And then you've got like friction, a year or two down the track. So we sort of decided just to twist that a little bit, which was more costly up front, but we thought in the long term, would benefit. So that was some of the thinking that we had.
That is true. I think generally, well, true in the theory. So for example, like depends on your company. So like if you just need engineers to build something and you've got a technical co-founder, then the idea, to be honest, early on is the co-founders are the functional leaders. So you can afford then to have individual contributors. As then you get to Series A, where you're going to expand then functions, where you might then need heavy investment in marketing all of a sudden, that's a dedicated unit, RevOps or business development or sales as an actual function then that you need. It's lower risk than if you've got a couple of like junior individual contributors to place someone on top, because they're not going to be inheriting like 7, 8, 10 people. They may only inherit 1 or 2. And if you've done a good job with your bar at the individual contributor level at seed, they should be good at really good talent. That said, regardless, the talent that's often attracted at seed, already a sizable portion of that, in my experience, do still struggle to retain and want to stay on even at Series A if you're moving very fast and you've got high traction, because they like the no process and the interaction with founders, and they really don't like it when they've got a leader on top, regardless, and there's more process coming in. And those that do carry on in that transition from seed to Series A tend to have the scalability to go on to the next round. But there are always inflection points where hires are aware, if they've been in multiple startups, of their sweet spot of where they tend to prefer to sit. And again, we'll talk about that in retention, no doubt, with equity. But while our retention strategy as a startup is to retain people, the harsh commercial reality of that is that's offset sometimes by realistically, certain people are best suited at certain periods of time within the startup and don't always scale at the rate of the company's growth.
Yeah, no, awesome. I can, it's very clear how valuable you can be for founders, especially first-time founders. You've got to seed round and you need to hire your team correctly. There's just so many variables. So wonderful insight there. And how would let's tackle some of these equity related questions with these roles. I mean, just say for example, you are a solo
Mm,
founder and you need to build,
mm.
get a couple of critical hires in, around seed. How do you see, the equity part of these packages working? What works? Yeah, what are you seeing?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say I'm not a co-founder expert in terms of matching those things up, although I advise on it. And I read Carter's recent report saying like co-founder equity is like really squiffy these days. It's actually not very balanced. So that can also cause problems. So that's a separate conversation. But if you are building a founding team, I think the thing that you need to be clued up on then is like, and that's a big question any founder, whether you're solo or any co-founder will ask me, is like, how do we think about our allocations? And the general rule, as you've quite rightly mentioned, from founding team versus a Series B or Series C, will look different. So the general rule, of course, is what's the logic here? If it's higher risk and the valuation is lower, we're likely to make a bigger grant here to your founding team member. And that's likely to decrease over time when the risk is less and the valuation goes up to later employees. So that's like the general rule of how we think about it. And then the second thing you sit with founders and discuss with them is like, what is our philosophy here in how we want to use and allocate equity? So, do we want to give equity for all? And we believe that that's important in our values and our culture for everyone to have a piece of the pie. Or do we only want to give it to leadership? Um, or do we want to give it to just the founding team and first round and then not later on? So they're like the fundamental questions you would discuss
What do
then on their
you
like general
And
attitude.
what are you finding? What are you finding? What's the trend? Is it
Yeah.
still? I mean, I think it's kind of like everybody gets equity is the majority sort of case
Yeah.
still. But how are you seeing it?
Yeah. So like in tech companies like UK and France, it's just a given. Like pretty much everyone gives equity to
Yeah,
everybody.
same
There
in the
are some
US,
other
Australia. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, of course. There are some, that don't do that. I've seen in the data and certain reports again, not through experience though, because I've pretty much been equity for all. But there are some. Apparently, the Netherlands is arguably on some data sets lower. Arguably Germany as well. So that's interesting
yeah.
to look into in
The
terms of
rules in Germany are so hard. Like it's just so much more
yeah.
difficult to
Well,
like technically issue it there for what I've seen.
yeah, I think VSOP has recently changed. I think it changed in May. I'm not an expert on
Oh
German
yeah,
allocations, but they've made it more advantageous and attractive now with some recent liftings on certain outcomes and provisions for employees there. But yeah, again, at least if you're hiring in Germany and you're hiring German employees, VSOP is so widely used there. It's not really it doesn't detract. They're just so used to that there, so it's pretty much all encompassing. And then I think like the other thing with founders to be mindful of then is like there's two extremes I tend to find with founders in founding allocations and offers. It's like they either offer like way too much, and then you've got like an unattractive cap table, and they haven't really understand the value exchange. Like they've got a very complicated business, and they've offered like a graduate X amount that may not really be in the right allocation distribution there. So it's really understand the leveling that comes with that with a bit of common sense on like the sort of percentages that we might offer. Or the other way where I've had, and this has honestly happened in the last 6-7 months, where I had a founder needing to hire like a founding engineer and, had an idea of the benchmarks and so forth. And then they didn't want to offer them that equity. And then you've got to really explain to them like how important that is on like a founding engineer. You have a tech business, it's understanding the absolute criticality of why, come back to the why we're even having equity then in the first place. That's
why?
just so
Yeah, what
important
did you
to kind of,
say?
yeah. Yeah, I said, look, these are the benchmarks. You're not a technical founder, so this is a critical hire to complement you. You have the prerogative and the right as the founder CEO to do whatever you like. That's not my problem, right? That's your
But
company.
but
But
like they're going to be
but
getting offers
but
with equity, and
yeah, my job is to help you win. So I will always put, ego aside, or whether some noses are out of joint, by telling you that's my value is the harsh truth on, what will help you succeed. And I have to stand by that. So back and forth, the hire was made. with the right level of equity. And the good thing now these days is it used to be a complete black box, complete black box, in terms of data and equity. Now, you've got VCs doing better data and reports now across their portfolios. You've got, index ventures even with calculators on their website online for you to look at in terms of how to look at salary, value, and cash on different raises. However, definitions of seed and expectations have changed somewhat, so I don't know if that model needs a bit more refining, but looking at that too. And you've got great platforms like Carter or even compensation SaaS products out there now that are also doing a lot of benchmarking and reports and are out there for you to use as well, beyond looking at founders. So there are quite a lot of resources now for founders to look into and upskill themselves on, in terms of their fluency, in terms of roughly at least what to offer at different rounds.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier. I think benchmarking is critical over the last few years for hiring and giving confidence in actually issuing equity. Going back depending on what country you're in, 5 or 10 years, issuing equity to a team was nearly impossible. By the time you had your accountant meetings and your lawyer meetings and you're trying to work out how much to give, it really was a bit hard, and everyone was just like, we won't worry about it. But through, software and systems and benchmarking and it's become like totally achievable, not too tricky. Pretty much every tech company is doing it. So if you're not doing it, you're behind the 8 ball. Some of the arguments for not doing it might be like, well, we just pay good salaries. And I think there is some truth to people just want cash. Like, I think there is some truth to that. I would still advocate that equity is important. It's sort of like on top of a good salary, in a lot of ways. I think, when you're benchmarking, I think at seed stage, you can maybe offset the cash component with the equity, but then from about Series A, it's really on top. And it's a bonus. That's an extra incentive. But then
That's
you
a
got the
great point.
retention benefits. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to add to that because I have strong views on this. I think the biggest issue you've got is when you're like offering loads of equity, as I mentioned earlier, and like the employee on the other side doesn't value it. So you have to understand, if you're going to bother offering it, your job as a founder is to build your fluency up on how to sell it and explain it.
Totally.
So like
I love this.
part of my coaching is like, wowzer, like, so here's a really good example. So a founder had offered a C-level a percentage of something, and I checked the offer email that went out, and they'd offered north of a percentage fully diluted. So I was like, oh dear, this is not good news to a board, because he didn't understand how to articulate dilution in that like high stake pressure negotiation on the phone with the candidate. I was like, oh dear, we need to fix this. So like we fixed that one way or the other, but moving forward, it's explaining and building up founder fluency to know that that's their active role in selling, is to explain like what type of option or what type of equity or stake they're offering. Also understanding then, how that can be valuable over time. How do you sell that story then to the candidate? Share some success stories of other companies out there to know that it is actually true. Explain dilution. So what that means is, Julie's going to get X amount. You've got X percentage now at C stage. The truth is, later rounds that could become diluted and be less stake of the pie and become maybe even less than 0.5%. But that's offset because you've got 40K in cash value now, but as our valuation goes up, that could be worth, say, closer to 1 million at the same size, even though your size of the pie has gone down. So, and the reason it's gone down is we're issuing more shares over time to different investors and different people. So, that's how you explain that, to show that there's still value going up, even though they understand that they are going to be diluted. And that's important. They know that they're being diluted when you get that. But I agree with you. What's the workaround then? I think there are, I don't agree that early on you should hire people who don't value equity at all. personally, because I think that's very important. I don't understand, if you were going to take the risk early on, why you wouldn't care about the equity, to be very frank.
100%.
So you
Yeah.
should 100%, 100%, if you're going to give your sweat equity, you want real equity in exchange. So that's very, very important, I think, to people. But I appreciate people might want to join a startup, and their circumstances may mean that they need a bit more cash and so forth. But we have to be commercial with this. We need to preserve cash. That is also sensitive to a business. So how do we think about this? Well, early on, you could make two offers. So you could make, within certain parameters, a lower equity offer and higher cash, or you could make a higher equity offer.
Yeah.
Higher
And
cash
let them
offer and
choose.
lower equity,
Yeah.
and let them
Cool.
choose. Now, you want to have some parameters around that, so you don't have massive variation of pay and then other claims and whatnot. But you're still trying to make sure total value of comp would still be
Yeah.
similar to people, but they've just had different areas of how they've played in that and made the decision. And that can be
Yeah.
useful. But
Could be like
ultimately,
10,
you want
10%
people
equity
to,
or 20% equity of the whole
yeah,
package, and you sort of let them choose. It's still within a range and
yeah,
it's still
yeah,
reasonable. Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
yeah. But ultimately, I'm still a strong believer that, equity should be a very important part of the value that people care about when they join a startup, certainly early on.
100%. 100%. I mean, you want the most talented people in the company. And, these talented people want skin in the game. That's a
Yeah,
big part of why they do it. I mean, they can have a
yeah,
job, but they want to change the world.
yeah,
They want to have an impact. They want to be part of a team, and they want to be part of the ownership structure. The best people want to be, in there having equity like from day one.
yeah.
It's
Yeah,
critical.
yeah. And in my opinion, the best talent, to be very frank, in your first 0 to probably 30 hires, are people that aspire to be founders and probably could be founders, but they don't
Mm,
want to take that risk. So you
hmm
want them to act like a founder. You do want multiple founder mentality early on. That entrepreneurial, true spirit as close to you as possible that it
That's
gets.
cool.
So you better be giving them some real skin in the game, as you mentioned.
Yeah. So, just say for argument's sake, they're getting 50K a year over 4 years, they're getting 200K worth of equity, which is like already a lot. But
Mm.
in early stage, you're doubling your value every year or two. So it's 200K, 400K, 800K. So in a matter of, 3 or 4 years, they can be having, million in equity,
Yeah,
which is
and you
just
can.
unbelievable. I mean, I know that's
Yeah.
it's probably slightly on the high end, but I mean, it's still a super meaningful amount of equity that they're generating.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And you can take that further, right? Because you can then discuss with them during the interview process, how performance conversations tie in with equity as well. So not only do they get their first offer and their first what's called tranche, their first amount
Mm,
of equity, if they
mm,
are a top performer, your philosophy could well be that we reissue additional equity on top.
yeah.
And to retain people, you want to be smart on your top performers. Let's just say you have a vesting schedule. What that means is you don't give the whole amount of equity to someone when they start. It's time bound. So they get little incremental pieces as they serve time in the company before they get the whole, which is the point of retaining them. But
Mm,
let's say they get to half that vesting, half that time bound period. So they've got half the equity vested. It's at that point then beyond, they're probably going to have more than they've got left. So they may be a flight risk. So you also want to be smart in your retention strategy of monitoring who's halfway through their vesting schedules to start thinking, shall
mm,
we be a bit more little and often now in terms
mm,
of that strategy so they can get even more,
yeah.
over time in terms of the value they get. And you can
Yeah.
decide then in their new grants, do you want to include a cliff? And what that means
Mm,
is they have to stay for the first year or a period of time before they get any sort of value or option vested or kept now for themselves, or do you then at least then give them a shorter period? You give them a load of options, but there's a shorter vesting schedule compared to their first offer that they may have had.
no, I like it. That's really smart. That's really smart. What about milestone-based vesting? Do you see that much? I mean, I think sometimes it's time-based, but you could also say, hey, if we could hit this certain
Yeah,
milestone, there could be additional options.
You can have performance-based vesting. It's less common, I'll be honest with you. Time-based
Yeah.
is much more likely. When you're looking
Yep.
at much more performance and milestone, you're probably looking at more of your classic LTIPs and corporates that the US have, where that's
Okay.
all like milestone performance-based. So that's a separate thing altogether. But
Yeah.
and I'm not an expert in the US LTIPs, but yeah, that's more performance-oriented. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And then with retention, another thing I found that's interesting that isn't always obvious, especially when you're starting out, is the fact that even though like they might be 2 or 3 years through and you do have that element of like, hey, I've earned a lot of my equity already, so it can be a little bit less of an incentive. You've mentioned ways to incentivize them with new grants and re-upping, and that's cool. But one thing I noticed as well is if the company value's gone up, say 2 or 3 or 4 times in that period, the dollar amount of equity that they're earning is like a lot. Like, and if they leave and go to another company, they go back to the baseline again, so they're earning, like a third or a quarter of the equity every year that they're earning with
Mm,
you. So I think it's make sure you have a 4-year vesting period. I know it's pretty standard now, but I think that's why it's
yeah.
important to have that nice and long, because in
Yeah.
that third and fourth year, the amount of equity they're earning, which was granted at the first year's valuation, can become, a really nice retention strategy.
Yeah, I think there's that, and it comes back to what do I want to say here? It comes back to also having a 4 year, because the market drives that, because that's pretty standard. So
Mm,
you you want to be careful to compete with vesting schedules, because sometimes I see like really long ones. It's rare actually, rather than sometimes.
mm.
And I don't advise that, because that can put people off. But if you also look at the average tenure, even in startups, it's like 2 years. That's my point. If they then go back, if they're really good and go back another early stage or another company where they can get a better grant, you need to be mindful of still granting again within that 4 year vesting schedule, and topping them up in addition if they're really, really that good. But I agree with you. The 4 year is important to have some sort of long term parameter. That's the point of it. But anything beyond that, I think you also need to be mindful. If you think of like the inflection points in a business, funding rounds aren't like 5 years between each round. And
Mm.
if you're doing well as a company, the types of talent, as I said, and the types of people you need, can people really scale multiples of, from, coming in at first stage to being like still there 9 years later and so forth? Who knows? Like, I care more about impact, to be honest, than tenure when it comes to like performance, to be very frank. That's all I would care about. So, having backloaded vesting and having like 6 year vesting schedules is really like probably incentivizing the wrong types of too long retention, to be honest. It's better to be
Yeah, yeah.
smarter, in my opinion. It's better to be smarter, in my opinion, with just top ups.
Cool. Totally makes sense. One thing you were saying before, which I loved, is just making sure that your team understand it and value it. I think this is the key
Mm,
of all this. It's so easy to just think, oh, okay, there's equity and they're going to get
yeah.
it. But from my
Mm,
experience, I mean, even onboarding at Cake, we have like all these steps and processes and FAQs, and then you'll have someone come in and say, oh, are you
yeah.
deducting my equity from my pay? Or like, do I have a tax problem? There's so many
Hmm.
ways for them to be confused. Um,
Yeah.
what do you, I mean, yeah, so we talked a bit about hiring, and when you're hiring, that's a key moment because you need to talk about what it's worth and what it could be worth, and the fact that the company really values it and they care about it, and it's going to be protected on their behalf. What about the rule, like the plan rules themselves and the way the scheme is set up? Do you find the team actually
Mm,
pay attention to that? Do they understand it? Is it a driver? Because from my perspective, these plant rules can be very company friendly and almost to the point where if you're like an employee reading it, you're like, I don't even respect this because you can basically take mine off me at any time. So
hmm.
how do you find that? Because it's quite important, but
Hmm.
I feel like it's a bit unknown by the employees, but
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So C-suite executives are more sensitive to this, and they're very clued up on this if they are a seasoned C-suite executive. So, and it
Yeah.
goes even higher than this. So like I've been privy to like what's called articles of association, which is kind of like board governance and board agreements with founders. And
Hmm.
like it goes even as high as this in terms of like understanding. where the employees sit as common shareholders, because
Totally.
when
It's really important stuff. Like, it's
yeah,
not
so when
like you don't,
yeah,
yeah, people don't realize
the
like that,
employees
that's
don't know
actually the
this.
rules of how this whole thing is. Yeah.
Yeah. So when the founders, so what this basically means for the audience is when the founders get new investment, they'll sign what's called a term sheet, which has terms around this investment. And the key thing that will affect people on this is liquidation preference. So what that protects is the investors to get their money back if things don't necessarily go as planned, or a sale, but it's not quite where we wanted it to be. And what that means is investors will have parameters where they'll or clauses where they'll state their priorities. So usually they're the first to get their same money back at the event of some not as optimal circumstance. Then they'll have multiples, so they can also get 1x back. So basically the same money. Well, 1x isn't that
Oh,
bad,
1x
but if
is
they're
fine.
asking
Sorry. Yeah, of course.
if they're
1x is
asking
fine.
for like if they want like 2 or 2x back, that's arguably then where people start kicking it off. And
Makes it
and
hard
then you
for
have your
the like 2x makes it hard for team members or founders to really ever get anything. Like you have to hit like a full home run in that case. But not, I mean,
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
maybe with 2 you can make it, but like, yeah.
yeah.
Just good
And
to
I think
know
that's the
this stuff.
thinking.
Like, are there
Yeah.
multiples on the preference stack? How big's the preference stack? What are the good levers and bad lever provisions? All these sorts of
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah. So on the preference, you'd also want to check, again, employees, they probably won't share all of this, but if you're a C-suite, they
No.
tend to have to if you push. But are they participating preference or non-participating? So non-participating will mean they get their bit back and their multiples, and then the rest of the gets distributed to the common shareholders. But the participating preference will mean they get all that, the same as non-participating. Plus, they get then a percentage share back in the remaining proceeds, just like the rest of the common shareholders. And that's the problem. That's not always
Mm.
as friendly then to employee outcomes. But on the share plan, to add to your point, yes, the main thing they want to be mindful of here is good lever and bad lever. So you don't want it completely up to the discretion, of who's who. But employee-friendly terms generally will say the following clause, not necessarily verbatim, but roundabout this. The employee will be deemed a good lever unless they're called a bad lever, and a bad lever is classified as for cause or doing something for cause. And then you list for cause, which means things like misconduct and a load of other things why they would be deemed a bad lever. But if you don't do those things, you're automatically deemed a good lever if you leave. That's what you want to be seeing ideally.
Yeah, which then means you get to keep all your vested equity. So whatever you vest, you keep if your lever is a good lever, and then whatever's unvested, you lose, and that's fine because you haven't vested it. And it can't really be taken off you unless you've done something wrong. I
Yeah.
mean, that's pretty standard, and that's kind of how it should
Yeah.
be, but it's good to kind of know that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
good to
I
know it's
just like
not
to
entirely
unpack
at
that
the
a little bit
discretion.
from time to time
Yeah.
and just kind of bring these things out so people can be signing on to companies. And like, if you don't have that, I mean, it's just a little bit of a red flag. It's not necessarily saying, hey, like these leaders are like a bit unscrupulous, but it's like they probably just haven't taken the time to get this right. And it's just something to think about. You probably want to work for a company that has, just good, fair, we call it like protecting the company, because the company does need it to protect them. It's like, hey, the company's got to control its equity in the case of an exit and in the case of a bad lever, and just keep its equity nice and tight and controlled is important governance. But at the same time, it needs to be employee friendly, and there is a nice
Yeah.
balance there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The only time I've seen this being a wider, deeper debate is if a founder transitions out and they're bringing a professional CEO in, because that clause might need more parameters around it so that they may get a huge amount of value and money on their shares in the first year and then leave, and actually you really do need to retain them for fundraising reasons or whatever, that professional CEO. So that becomes a bit more complicated in how you discuss that clause in more detail for retention purposes, but that's the
fair
only
enough.
time where
Because
that's been more complex.
that's a real all or nothing hire. So it's like, hey, buddy,
Yeah.
like you got to deliver. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the last piece of this kind of equity story thing that I like, we love to talk about making sure people understand their equity is like treating them like an investor. Treat your team like investors.
Mm, mm.
We love to teach our community about this. They are investors. They're on your cap table. They own a piece of
Yep.
the company,
Yeah.
normally via options, but sometimes it's exercised into shares as well. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if they don't know what's going on, they're not going to value it, right?
Yeah. I love that. And that's what I say to candidates. I love this because sometimes the candidate will go to me, well, I've got a better offer from, so and so's company down the road and all that. And I say to them, look, you have to think like an investor.
Yeah,
Truly now, if we look at everything, which company do you think honestly is going to have the highest chance of making it? On
totally.
based on all these other things, like have we got the best team? Have we got a product out there? Where is our traction compared to theirs? Because sometimes it doesn't mean that so and so's offer better down the line if their team and everything else doesn't actually work and it's not really in their favor. So you have to be smart when
Yeah.
you're a candidate. You're making a bet too, and be wise with that. Yeah,
Oh, I love
agree.
that. I love that. And then, yeah, from the founder's perspective, it's like, get in your all hands, update your team,
Yes.
make sure they know what's going on, talk about when the next raise is, talk about liquidity events, talk
Mm-hmm.
about potential dividends, like whatever's coming up that can incentivize your team around valuing their equity, understanding it, wanting to row
Yeah.
together, to make these, milestones and outcomes happen. I think it's a wonderful driver for performance and yeah, just very motivating.
I agree. I think, I think what you're saying here is like bake it into your culture and like your day-to-day communications and milestones and that in the business. And but I randomly had the founder once be like, oh, but what if there's problems then? Because employees are so fluent then on these things, like, will that like be a problematic? And that then
Mm,
you end up in a discussion then, okay, well, what do you do in a crisis or a down round and so forth? And work
mm,
around that. So in COVID, for example, when we were trying to preserve runway, some companies out there decided to do salary sacrifice because they had to preserve runway, but then they had the advantage then of leveraging their options, their equity, to give
mm,
them more in exchange for the salary that they sacrifice. So that's a genius idea. So like
mm,
there are always ways that people will still value and want to stay in if you've built your culture around that. And
mm,
also in a down round, what's the workaround there? Well, maybe actually you might have not qualified for things like in the UK, we have what's called EMI options, which is the most advantageous scheme you can have for employees, which I won't go into the granularities. But to qualify as a UK company for these types of share options, you have to be in certain parameters. For example, 250 people, 30 million in gross assets underneath that threshold, and a few other bits and bobs. But if you are in a down round, then at least you may actually requalify for some of those classifications again. So you might want to release people out of their existing type of options and then
mm.
reissue options then at the lower valuation that might benefit people again in the long run.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing advice. I think, yeah, starting with leadership and strategy and culture with this stuff is critical. And then it just flows through to a much more successful overall, value creation from your team equity. And, transparency is something that almost always works for the better. Your team is going to know if you're struggling. I don't think you have
Yeah.
to share everything because founders and executives and investors are very aware of all these things. And so we're not saying, hey, like every little thing has to be shared because that's just not good communication. And it's an
Mm.
important part of being a founder and executive to be able to understand
Mm-hmm.
how to nuance the communication, but being transparent and open is normally the better strategy would be my opinion. And yeah, your team's not stupid. Like if you're having difficulties, they're gonna know. And the fact that
I
you were
agree.
open with them and transparent and you work through it with them is probably going to
Yeah.
build trust. And yeah,
I'm with you on that. Massively pro transparency anyway, because it just makes life easier, to be honest, in my opinion. I think if you treat people like adults, they'll give more than go above and beyond on that front. So I think that's probably like for me one of the more important things for respect and performance in culture. But I appreciate there are varying spectrums on that in terms of founder perspectives on that.
yeah. Hey, I'm gonna have to switch us up and move us along a bit. That was gold. There's so much gold
Go
there.
on.
Like that was just like pure gold for everyone
Oh,
listening. I'm so stoked with that. But just in the interest of time, I'm gonna let's talk about Developer. What's going on 2024? Like what's the rest of the year look like? How's
yeah.
things shaping up? I'd love to learn a little bit more.
Thanks for asking. So we've actually done quite a lot of retained searches this year and coaching. But as I said, I'm building this program more specific to founders, narrowing the focus now from less on the more holistic coaching. I prefer to do more holistic advisory now and focus more on a program that doubles down on teaching them about hiring and on leading leaders. So I'm refining that now to scale that across the market later on in the year. So that's really what will be coming from us, is more value add to our founder community on that front.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, everyone check it out. I mean, building teams, as we talked about at the top, it's so critical. There's so much to learn, and we need experts around us as founders to move fast. You do need to be moving super fast. So absolutely, highly recommend checking that out. Obviously, for those of you listening, what a powerhouse Beth is, so definitely get in touch. And look, we're going to finish on a question we normally finish on, which is about creative, healthy lifestyle. You were saying it's summer there in London, which, I mean, London's not the easiest place to be outdoors and in nature and that kind of thing. But yeah, how do you sort of see that for yourself and the team? Health as a driver of performance and creativity. Any insights for us?
I mean, this is a bit philosophical. I've gone on a lot of big journey for me, to be honest, because I built this company to work for me and my lifestyle. So I'm not a VC-backed founder. I'm on a different path in my life right now, although I help founders win in that space. So this company is to work for me and what I want out of it. And of course, the mission is around founders too. That's why we exist. But there is a balance now that I brought to my life consequently. The best book I've read and reread actually in the last year is The 4 Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss. And what that book taught me, more in the like solopreneur to very early small boutique team philosophy that we have, is I now changed my lifestyle. So I work in very, very intense sprints. So that means I can take some serious time off then, rather than like 2 days here or a week there, but work extremely intensely over a quarter. And then I can rest for a little bit or be very light touch then for a few weeks after that. And that's really worked well for my life, to have like longer periods of rest, but more intense sprints, because I've learned at least my strength for me is like intensity over ridiculous periods of time. But so I prefer to do that on a big sprint and then take some time off. But also my strength and my flaw is being super rational and analytical in terms of my personality type. So I've really enjoyed getting more into the spirituality side of things, and I know a lot of founders are also
Yeah,
interested in that side too.
I love it
And
too. Yeah.
that's what I want to start. Yeah, I want to start getting more into that. Is my next piece, like meditating and connecting more with like human beings and connection. I'm speaking to a founder at the moment I went for a drink with last week. I'm not working with him actually, but he's extremely successful in the UK. And he's reading a book called Lost Connections right now. And he sends me photos of like what he's reading in that. And I think there's something to be said in that in terms of like, what value can the people teams bring in the future? Because I think things are going to change quite significantly in the future. And I think our value is going to be heart and connection. I think it's interesting because people teams have historically had to become more commercial. But ironically, I think the value will come full circle the other way in terms of what we can
Oh,
bring in years to come.
that's really beautiful. What a great way to finish. Thank you for sharing that. That was amazing.
No
I hope you're going
worries, no
somewhere
worries.
hot. I hope you're going somewhere hot and sunny on this time off. And
I'll be on, Jason, I'm on my way to, I'm nearer your neck of the woods. I'm going to Bali.
oh, amazing. You'll love it.
Yeah.
So beautiful this time of
Okay.
year. We'll
DM
get some
me,
great connection
send me
in.
recommendations. Yeah. Send me
I will, I will.
recommendations.
Oh yeah, totally. Well, look, what a lovely way to finish. We all need to spend some time in Bali and making better connections. So thanks, Beth. You're a legend. I'm so
Thank you
grateful
so
for
much,
you joining.
Jason. Thank
Cool.
you.
See you,
Thanks
everyone.
again. Bye.
Bye.